Welcome back to the GCN Racing News Show. Coming up this week, was the gravel stage of the Tour de France genius or a circus that just doesn't belong? I'll be discussing what was definitely an epic Sunday at the race, as well as wrapping up the first week and the first stage of the Giro Donne. This week in the world of racing, we learnt that you shouldn't stop at the roadside to kiss your wife at the Tour de France, unless you're willing to pay the UCI fine of 200 Swiss francs. That is what happened to Julien Bernard on Friday, although I'm sure it was worth the money. If you're wondering, that fine was because the incident damaged the image of the sport, apparently. We also learnt that watching riders race down the descent of the Galibier is heart-in-your-mouth stuff. And finally, we learnt that the much-anticipated and in some cases feared gravel stage of the Tour de France produced the most excitement and drama of any stage so far. Does that mean that gravel has a place in Grand Tours? Well, it certainly does for me, and I'll explain my opinion, but it doesn't for everybody, so I'll give the counter-argument as well. Firstly, I'm going to do my best to break down what happened, which might be quite hard without making this an hour-long show, because a lot happened. In fact, rather than giving a blow-by-blow account, I'll focus firstly on the main GC action and then talk through how the stage was won. Now, as you would expect, there wasn't much action from the GC riders and teams in the opening 45Ks ahead of the first gravel sector. They were just being attentive, trying to stay near the front, out of trouble, and save energy for what was to come. The first of 14 gravel sectors came after around 47Ks of racing, and it was Red Bull Bora Hansgrohe who had the best position there. With the breakaway already up the road by just a handful of seconds, they tried to slow the pace down, so the likes of Healy, Pidcock and a few others attacked off that pace, sensing that the GC teams wanted to slow things down and keep their leaders safe. The first big moment came on the third sector. UAE and Visma entered side by side, but it turned out that by luck or design, Visma had chosen the better side, i.e. the smoother one. Everybody soon realised on that climb that they needed to be over on the right. Either way, it caused chaos behind, with riders forced to stop, and many of them unable to get going again due to the gradient and the surface. The big losers at that point were Roglic and his Bora team, who got caught behind a split. With Visma, Ineos and Soudal working in the group ahead, it was a worrying moment for all Roglic fans. He did get back, but only after a very hard chase by his teammates, and even then he had to close the last part of the gap himself. Vingegaard had his own scare a little after that with a puncture, but thankfully for him, Jan Tratnik's bike is a very similar setup, so he's quick to jump on that and rejoin the group of favourites. It's that bike, though, that he'd stay on for the rest of the race. There was no opportune time to change back onto his own. The next big move came with 75Ks to go, Remco Evenepoel attacking on a tarmac climb. Now, my first thought then was, this could be a huge waste of energy for him. So you've got a load of Visma, UAE and Ineos riders behind who can chase that down. But instead, Pogačar decides to go after him and only Vingegaard can follow. So you've got this bizarre situation where those three catch the early breakaway and then immediately stop because Vingegaard is refusing to work. I mean, the guys in the breakaway must have thought they were hallucinating, seeing the top three in GC join them for about 30 seconds before they suddenly do a disappearing act. Now, there was a lot of debate as to whether Vingegaard should have worked with Evenepoel and Pogačar to distance all their other rivals. That is rubbish as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I understand the frustration. We'd have all loved to have seen him carry on full gas, but yesterday's stage was all about not losing time for Vingegaard. Let's not forget that Evenepoel and Pogačar have won countless one-day races through their careers. Vingegaard has only won one. He's not a specialist in that sort of thing, that sort of terrain, so why would he risk exposing himself at 75Ks to go to attacks from those two deeper into the stage, when basically he's got a load of teammates behind who are classic specialists who can keep him safe through to the end? You may disagree, but I think he had a lot more to lose in that situation than he had to gain. Evenepoel had his own issues a few Ks later, caught out of position on another sector, losing all his speed and having to use a lot of energy to get back on. Of course, there were more attacks from Pogačar, the biggest of which came with 22 Ks to go. Following him that time were Laporte and Jorgensen, But the problem for Visma was that Vingegaard was in trouble, just a little bit. Firstly, Laporte dropped back to pace him, and then Jorgensen did the same. So if Vingegaard had pressed on with Pogačar and Evenepoel earlier in the stage, he'd probably have found himself in trouble, but without teammates to put out the fire. Pogačar gave it one more nudge with 9Ks to go, but that time Vingegaard was straight onto his wheel. And so after all that chaos, all that drama, we ended the day with all the GC favourites in the same group on the same time. But that didn't take anything away from what was a thoroughly entertaining battle. In fact, it makes it better that things are still so close going into the second week of the race. So on to the stage win, and again, there was so much that happened, I can't go through it all. The group that would end up contesting the win was Healy, Stuyven, Lutsenko, G, Pidcock, Romo, Aramburu and Turgis. With the likes of Van der Poel and Girmay closing in on them behind, they made sure they worked well together until they could be sure they wouldn't close the gap. Lutsenko was the first to make a move, but when that was brought back, Stuyven went. He's not won a race since Milano-San Remo in 2021, and it looked so good for him, didn't it? Normally in those situations, there's enough hesitation behind that the elastic finally snaps, but that didn't happen. Those behind rode well enough together they kept him in sight, and then a couple of big turns/attacks from Healy and Lutsenko closed the gap completely. And so we had a sprint. Lutsenko went first, trying to spring a surprise, but Aramburu reacted immediately. G went next, but Turgis got onto his wheel, then came around it and had enough power to hold off Pidcock to take a much needed win for Total Energy. Turgis was incredibly disappointed that the team didn't get an invite into some of the biggest classics this spring, but I'm sure he's forgotten that disappointment now. That was by far the biggest win of his career, by the way. Fair play to Derek G, though, in third. He was in the breakaway the whole day, right from the first one. He averaged 324 watts for the whole 200 kilometres, all 4.5 hours of the stage, and for the first hour, he averaged 402 watts. Imagine doing that and then still having 3.5 hours still to go. So, now the dust has literally settled, we can look back at a stage that was really exciting from start to finish, but one in which we almost had no change in the GC. The only mover was Derek G, whose exploits in the break moved him up 5 places to 9th overall. So was it worth all the stress? Absolutely. That was the one stage of the race so far that I've sat watching intently from start to finish. There was barely a moment where nothing was happening, and if nothing was happening, you knew that the next drama was just around the corner. That is professional sport at its very best, in my opinion, compelling viewing throughout. And I'm pretty sure that will be reflected in the viewing numbers. I no longer have access to them, but having seen the ebb and flow of audience figures at different races and stages of races for the last few years, I can almost guarantee that yesterday's stage was the most watched of the race so far. And that'll be same for live, on-demand, highlights and social clips. I'm pretty sure there would have been more eyeballs on pro cycling yesterday than at any other time in the season so far. To me, it was a great advert for the sport, the type of stage that, if somebody turns cycling on for the first time, will pique their interest. Yesterday's stage will have got a lot of new people into the sport, some of whom are going to become lifelong fans of it. That level of exposure has got to be good for the sponsors, of course. I mean, yes, the Tour de France already has a huge audience, but could it be bigger? Absolutely. Stages like yesterday will only serve to increase the following of our sport, because I can't imagine many people watching it and saying to themselves, I'm not going to watch cycling anymore. Now, there are quite a few counter-arguments to that, many of which were highlighted in replies to a post I made on X yesterday. So let's go through them, shall we? Number 1, luck. Now, the argument here is that there's too much potential for bad luck that could ruin the GC ambitions of star riders who prepared for months to be at their best for the Tour de France. And yes, I get that, but I would also argue that it's not purely down to luck. Can punctures be avoided? Well, you can't mitigate that danger completely, but you can certainly make equipment choices that are going to reduce your chances of that happening. That might mean that the bike doesn't roll quite as fast as it would do on your fastest tyres, but that's a risk-reward choice that riders and teams have to make. I'd also suggest that the rider's ability to pick the right lines will go some way to mitigating the risk of punctures. also the way they ride over the gravel and distribute their body weight, and also their positioning within the group to allow them to see any big rocks or potholes that might be in front of them. I don't have the data to prove it, but I would wager a lot on rider skill having a bearing on the number of mechanicals or punctures they have. And skill to me should be a part of winning Grand Tours, not just a watts per kilo or watts per CDA test. Number 2, danger. Yes, riding over loose gravel presents its dangers when compared to smooth tarmac, but at the same time, there are no roundabouts, no central reservations or speed bumps on gravel roads, the things that would often cause big crashes on the tarmac. And I would also make an argument that finishing a stage at the foot of the Galibier is far more dangerous than 30 k's of gravel roads. Thankfully, there were no major incidents on stage 4, but in my opinion again, to have riders racing for time on a mountain descent puts them at far more risk of serious injury than a few gravel roads. Number 3, stress on teams. There is a lot more that goes into a stage like yesterday than a normal road stage. Adjustments to bikes means that more work for the mechanics, and the teams then have to place huge numbers of staff on the side of the road with wheels in case of punctures. That's because the team cars can be so far behind that it's far better to get a change from the side of the road in the case of a puncture or a mechanical. It also helps with feeding, of course. So yes, it's a burden on the teams, but most of them have very big budgets and should be able to cope with that for a single stage. Number 4, it's a circus. I saw this a lot yesterday, particularly referring to the third gravel sector, in which we saw world-class bike riders having to walk or run up a gravel climb. And I understand that. Perhaps it does make a mockery of the sport and the rider's profession, but once again, it comes down to positioning and line choice and skill. Did we see any of the big names walking? No. As you can probably tell, my opinion is that there is a place for gravel stages and cobbled stages at Grand Tours, so long as they aren't too extreme. But your opinion might be completely different, so please let me know what your thoughts were about yesterday's stage in the comments section below. I'm sure there's going to be some strong opinions on both sides of the fence. Right, let me move on to the other stories from the first week of the Tour now, and I've got to start with Biniam Girmay. I don't think Girmay was even supposed to ride the Tour this year, but he crashed out at the Giro, and that changed his plans and that of his team Intermarché. He's one of the only riders, I think, who can be thankful for crashing, because he made history on stage 3, becoming the first black African rider to win a stage at the Tour de France, and he backed that up with another win on Saturday. That puts him in a commanding lead in the points classification. His 224 points puts him 96 clear of last year's winner Jasper Philipsen, with the Duracell bunny Jonas Abrahamsen in third. And yes, I know it's the Energizer bunny over in the US before the comments go wild. The other huge story, yes, number 35. I did a full video breaking down Mark Cavendish's stage win, in which I also covered a lot of his career, so I'm not going to go into full details again, but my word, was that not incredible? I do see a lot of people hating on Brits actually, banging on about the potential 35th stage win for Cav, but I personally think it's justified. I mean, it doesn't matter what nationality you are, breaking the record for the number of stage wins at the Tour de France is huge. And if anybody breaks it again in the future, which is a tall order, it'll be just as big whoever does it. Another point of note from the first week of racing was the rise of the smaller teams. Total Energy, Astana, Intermarché, DSM, Arkea, Jayco. These are not teams with the biggest budgets in the sport, and a lot of them are fighting to keep their spots as World Tour teams, so it's been great to see them doing so well. Of the bigger teams, only UAE and Soudal Quickstep have ticked off a stage win so far, although if Patrick Lefevere is watching this, I've no doubt he'll be in the comments talking about how tight his budget is. It's also been great that the sprint stages have been dominated not by one team and one rider. Yes, Girmay has 2 wins, but they were very different sprints. Cavendish and Groenewegen have taken the others, whilst Alpecin and Philipsen just haven't got it right in the way they were this time last year. I also really enjoyed watching Evenepoel win the time trial. Yes, he was the favourite, but we've got to remember that this is his first Tour de France, and so far, so good. There's a long way still to go, of course, but he's not really put a foot wrong so far, and is rewarded with second on GC going into the first rest day. Speaking of the GC, this is how things look with 12 stages remaining. Today, Pogačar in yellow, 33 seconds in front of Evenepoel. Vingegaard sits third on 1 minute 15 seconds, and given his injuries from that crash in April, that's blooming impressive. Roglic is in 4th. So up to this point, it is the big four that fill the top 4 places. Ominously though, Almeida and Ayuso sit 5th and 6th, leaving UAE with a lot of cards to play. They want to use that strategy next week. Then it's Rodriguez of Ineos at 2:31. Landa a further minute behind that, Derek G in 9th and Matteo Jorgensen in 10th. In 11th, it's Alexander Vlasov. He had a really nasty crash yesterday, and I think we were all concerned when he got back on his bike so quickly. He was clearly unsteady on his feet when he clambered out of the ditch, and there seemed to be no concussion protocol conducted before he started riding again. He was at the race doctor's car quite quickly, but it was another reminder that the concussion protocol still needs to be worked on. Jonas Abrahamsen still leads the KOM competition. He's 13 points clear of Pogačar, but the biggest climbs are still to come, so his days in that jersey are probably numbered. He's been a standout rider at the race so far though, hasn't he? Amazing work by him. Remco Evenepoel is in the white jersey as best young rider, 1 minute 43 in front of Ayuso, whilst UAE Team Emirates are 6 minutes clear of Soudal Quickstep in the team's classification. The race will continue tomorrow with another day for the sprinters, whilst the mountains start in earnest this weekend with the first mountaintop finish of the race on Plateau de Bay on Sunday. I will move on to the Giro d'Italia Donne now, which kicked off yesterday in Brescia with the first of 8 stages and the only time trial of the race. At 15.7 kilometres, it was long enough to create some significant gaps amongst the GC favourites, and it was local favourite Elisa Longo Borghini who took an early advantage for Lidl Trek. One of the early starters, she blitzed around the course at an average speed of almost 46 km/h to take victory by a single second over Grace Brown. Lidl Trek placed 2 in the top 3, with Brodie Chapman 3rd at 13 seconds. Lotte Kopecky, who was tipped by some as the favourite for the opening stage, had to settle for 5th on the day, almost half a minute down, but it was much worse for some of the other GC contenders. Gaia Riolini lost over a minute, albeit to her teammate, so not a disaster, whilst Niamh Fisher-Black and Mavi Garcia were at 1:16 and 1:20 respectively. Niamh Bradbury also didn't fare too well, conceding 1 minute 47. The race continues today with a relatively flat stage, but the first summit finish of the race is tomorrow. You can catch the whole race live and on demand on Discovery Plus and Max, where you can watch a full season of pro bike racing. A reminder now that we have a huge collection of t-shirts and other merchandise available over at shop.globalcyclingnetwork.com, including a French collection, which is where you'll find this one. Whilst I'm at it, a huge thank you to everyone who's joined as a member on our YouTube channel. We've really been quite overwhelmed at the support we're getting at the moment. So the middle casquette tier will give you access to 50 of our documentaries that were formerly on GCN+. So it's also been great to see the views and the comments on those. I'm going to finish this week's show on a very sombre note. At the Tour of Austria last week, we had a tragic accident that resulted in the loss of a young man's life. On the descent of the Grossglockner, Norway's Andre Dreger crashed and sustained injuries that he was unable to survive. The 25-year-old has spent the last 4 years riding for the Norwegian team Co-op Repsol, who posted this on Saturday evening. On Saturday the 6th of July, following a very serious crash during the descent of the Grossglockner at stage 4 of the Tour of Austria, Andre crashed and sustained severe injuries. Our entire team is devastated by this tragic accident, and our thoughts and prayers are with Andre's family and loved ones and his team Co-op Repsol during this incredibly difficult time. The messages of condolence came flooding in from all quarters of the cycling world, and we would of course like to add ours to them. Our thoughts are very much with his family, friends and teammates at what is a horrific time for them. Rest in peace, Andre. It's always very difficult just to move on from something like that, but I will just go through the results of the race out of respect for the competitors there, who obviously could have had no idea that this tragedy would happen. With the final stage held as a ceremonial ride in honour of Dreger, Diego Ulissi was the overall victor. He'd won stage 3 in front of Magnus Sheffield. Ineos Grenadiers won 2 stages with Ganna and Rivera. Davide De Preto of Jayco won his first pro race on stage 1, whilst in the prologue, 19-year-old Cameron Rogers beat Filippo Ganna. He's someone to watch for the future, that's for sure. Right, that is all for this week. Stay safe out there, everyone, and I'll see you next Monday.